Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Jaya Gauranitai, 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 Jaya Gauranitai, 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 Jaya Gauranitai, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada. Okay, Hare Krishna. So verse today is chapter 3, verse 34. So yeah, if you have your smartphones, or you can sort of search for it on a website called Vedabase, the Bhagavad Gita. So what we'll be doing is reading the translation, the Sanskrit, and then the translation, and then the commentary, or purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. So chapter 3, verse 34. 334? Yeah. Okay. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay. Indriyasya arthe ragadvesho vyavastito teyornavashamagachet dohi asya paripantino. So that's the Sanskrit of the verse reading today. It's transliteration, or the word by word for the Sanskrit. So indriyasya, of the senses, indriyasya artha, in the sense objects, raga, attachment, dvesho, also detachment, vyavastito, put under regulations, teyo, of them, na, never, vasham, control, agachet, one should come, though those, he certainly, asya, his, paripantino, stumbling blocks. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Manor, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. There are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. Purport. Those who are in Krishna consciousness are naturally reluctant to engage in material sense gratification, but those who are not in such consciousness should follow the rules and regulations of the revealed scriptures. Unrestricted sense enjoyment is the cause of material engagement, but one who follows the rules and regulations of the revealed scriptures does not become entangled by the sense objects. For example, sex enjoyment is a necessity for the conditioned soul, and sex enjoyment is allowed under the license of marriage ties. According to scriptural injunctions, one is forbidden to engage in sex relationships with any other woman other than one's wife. All other women are to be considered as one's mother. But in spite of such injunctions, a man is still inclined to have sex relationships with other women. These propensities are to be curbed, otherwise they will be stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. As long as the material body is there, the necessities of the material body are allowed, but under rules and regulations, and yet we should not rely upon the control of such allowances. One has to follow those rules and regulations and attach to them, because practice of sense gratification under regulations may also lead one to go astray. As much as there is always a chance of an accident, even on the royal roads, although they may be very carefully maintained, no one can guarantee that there will be no danger even on the safest road. The sense enjoyment spirit has been current for a very long time, owing to material association. Therefore, in spite of regulated sense enjoyment, there is every chance of falling down. Therefore, any attachment for regulated sense enjoyment must also be avoided by all means. But attachment to Krishna consciousness, or acting always in the loving service of Krishna, detaches one from all kinds of sensory activities. Therefore, no one should try to be detached from Krishna consciousness at any stage of life. The whole purpose of detachment from all kinds of sense attachment is ultimately to become situated on the platform of Krishna consciousness. So we'll just recite some few prayers before talking about this verse. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Svayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamsha Shri Rupam Sagarjatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamsha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kantha Radha Kantha Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Brindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriya Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So we're reading from chapter 3 today. So does anyone know what chapter 3 is entitled? What's the name of chapter 3? Any guesses? Karma Yoga, yes, excellent, Prabhu. So what does Karma Yoga actually mean? Does anyone know? What is the meaning of Karma Yoga? Any suggestions? Yes, karma means action. Yeah, whatever action. Do you want to elaborate further? What do you mean, like, in what sort of actions does Karma Yoga pertain to? Yes. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, excellent. So karma means action, as you correctly mentioned, and yoga means to connect with the Lord or to do it in a spirit of service to God. So it's basically performing all our activities in a mood of pleasing or connecting to God. So at the start of chapter 3, Arjuna asks a very similar question to what he'd asked in chapter 2. So the essential question is whether he should fight in the war or not to fight. So of course the context of the Bhagavad Gita was that it was spoken on a battlefield where Krishna acts as Arjuna's charioteer. And Arjuna, upon seeing the armies, his relatives on the opposing side, becomes quite overwhelmed. And he's in a dilemma as to whether to fight or not. And so the questions that's been asked in the earlier chapters by Arjuna is especially whether he should fight or not. And the main concern Arjuna has at the start of the 3rd chapter is whether he would be implicated in any sinful reactions or bad karma by fighting. And this is the purpose of chapter 3, because Krishna goes on to explain the process of karma yoga throughout the chapter. And when one engages in karma yoga or doing activities or action in a mood of trying to please God or serve God without any selfish intention, then ultimately Krishna explains that there's no karmic implication, because karma can only be there if you're doing some activity for your own personal enjoyment. And there's a very famous verse in the verse in the 3rd chapter. So yajnarthat karmanonyatra lokoyam karma bandhanaha tad artham karma kaunteya mukta sangha samachara. Work done as a sacrifice for Vishnu has to be performed, otherwise work causes bondage in this material world. Therefore, O son of Kunti, perform your prescribed duties for his satisfaction, and in that way always remain free from bondage. And Krishna also explains the importance of not abandoning one's dharma or duty in order to set the right example. So Krishna, as we know, is Bhagavan, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, so he naturally has no duty to perform. But yeah, in the 23rd verse of the 3rd chapter, he says, "For if I ever fail to engage in carefully performing prescribed duties, O Partha, certainly all men would follow my path." So Arjuna was a natural leader in society, and if he failed to engage in his duties, then everyone would follow and not follow, the dharma. And Prabhupada explains the purport. So just a verse prior to what we're reading today, so we're reading from the 34th verse. In the 33rd verse, it's stated, Krishna again stresses the importance of engaging in one natural occupational activities. So he says, "Even a man of knowledge acts according to his own nature, for everyone follows the nature he's acquired from the 3 modes. What can repression accomplish?" So Prabhupada explains in the purport to 333 that no one should suddenly give up his prescribed duties and become a so-called yogi or transcendentalist artificially, because if you're going against your dharma, then that's simply not going to work. And therefore, in response to Arjuna's questions at the start of the 3rd chapter, Krishna is quite unequivocal about the answer. He says that Arjuna should certainly perform his duty as a warrior and engage in the battle. And in fact, if he was to abandon his fight, if he was abandoning the duty, then that would be going against his dharma, and that would actually lead to sinful reactions. And that's sort of the preamble that leads us to today's verse we're reading, the 34th verse in the 3rd chapter. And I'll just read the translation again, just so that we remember where we are. "There are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization." So how this verse fits in with the wider context of this chapter is that whilst Arjuna has been told to engage in his duties as a warrior, whilst performing his duties, he should not be distracted by the distractions that come with the role. So as a Kshatriya or a king, which Arjuna was, he should avoid excessive raga or attachment towards sense objects, and he should avoid dvesha or aversion towards things that take one away from sense objects. So what do I mean by sense objects? So essentially sense objects are the things that the 5 senses place importance to. So that would be form, sound, smell, taste, and touch, respectively. So let me just give you some examples of how this works. So within human society, there's 4 varnas. Has anyone heard of these 4 varnas? So I already mentioned one of the names, Kshatriya, but what could the other 3 varnas be? Yes? Brahmana, yes? Shudra, yes, excellent. So you mentioned 4 there. So Brahmanas are the intellectual class. So they're the priests, the teachers, the philosophers, the academics. The Kshatriyas comprise of the administrative class. So they're your rulers, your leaders. And Arjuna was an example of one of the Kshatriyas. So he was from the princely order. He was from the royal order. Vaishyas are your mercantile class. So these are your business people, your farmers. And your Shudras are the working class, so they're your general laborers and tradespersons. So we kind of find that within society, whether in Vedic times or even today, like there's a natural delineation between these 4 varnas. So some people are inclined towards sort of more intellectual activities, whereas some people sort of more about law and order and so forth. And therefore, individuals within each varna have a natural inclination towards various things. So let me just give you an example. For the Vaishyas or for the mercantile community, they are naturally drawn towards making money, and that's what stimulates them because ultimately they're business people. So this inclination cannot be denied, and Krishna has explicitly stated that in the verse previously. Nigraham kim karishyati, what will repression accomplish? However, if a Vaishya has excessive attachment or excessive greed towards obtaining money, and therefore that Vaishya does business through illegal means, so I don't know, does very sinful acts, illegal means like opens an ammunition factory and selling ammunition terrorists, for example, then clearly such disproportionate greed would need to be avoided. And this is the rag, or this is the attachment that Krishna is asking to regulate. And similarly, it's a common principle that everyone should give in charity, but if a Vaishya says that, oh, I'm too attached to money, it's just my nature, and I'm just going to be too greedy for wealth, and I'm not going to give anything in charity, then this sort of aversion or this sort of dvesha towards doing the right thing, towards giving in charity, it must also be avoided. So similarly, Kshatriyas, or royal kings in previous ages, they were allowed to have multiple wives, and the reason for that was, they had a lot of excessive passion, but they had a lot of influence and wealth. But the main thing was that they were able to look after each wife sort of very, very well. And if the Kshatriya king sort of demonstrated dvesha or aversion in fulfilling his duty in terms of looking after each individual wife, then clearly that's wrong. And if the Kshatriyas were to cast an evil eye towards the wives of others, or demonstrate raga or undue excessive attachment in that way, then that is also wrong. So Prabhupada, within the purport we're discussing today, actually talks about the raga and dvesha in the context of grahastha, or married life. So the grahastha ashram is one of the 4 orders of life. So we mentioned the 4 varnas. Does anyone know what the 4 ashramas are? Excellent. Yeah. What does brahmachari mean? Like what? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Excellent, excellent, yeah. So you also mentioned the sort of broad age categories of each ashram. So brahmachari life is essentially student life. Student life, as you mentioned, is sort of from about 0 to 20, 25. And then there's married life, which is approximately from 25 to 50. And then there's vanaprastha life, which is retired life. And then there's renounced order, which is the sannyas ashram. So again, like society is naturally divided into the 4 ashramas, the 4 varnas, you also have the 4 ashramas, as you rightly mentioned. And out of the 4 ashramas, the grahastha ashram is the only ashram where one can engage in sex within the context of sacred marriage and for the purpose of procreating children. So it's really sort of emphasized within this verse that if this attachment is not regulated, then it can also lead to promiscuity. It's explained in the purport that sense gratification under regulations may lead one to go astray, as much as there is always the chance of an accident, even on the rural roads. So that's sort of described in the purport. So even though one may be within the precincts of dharma, if one tries to be the enjoyer within a relationship, then that will eventually lead to frustration and a fall down from religious principles. So Prabhupada continues, the sense enjoyment spirit has been current for a very long, long time owing to material association. Therefore, in spite of regulated sense enjoyment, there is every chance of fall down. The reason for this is because ultimately, sense enjoyment, however much one engages in it, can never really satisfy. And in the 39th verse of the 3rd chapter explained, Avritam jnanamitena jnanino nityaverena kama rupena kaunteya dushparena anulena cha. I'm just going to move myself so I don't sure everybody should say that. So the 39th verse of the 3rd chapter, essentially its translation is, thus the wise living entity's pure consciousness becomes covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like fire. So no matter how much ghee of material enjoyment you try and put in the fire of desire or the fire of lust, it will actually blaze even more. So the issue with trying to be an enjoyer within a marital relationship, or for that matter, any sort of relationship, is because the excessive raga or the excessive attachment that's there, if one tries to be the enjoyer, causes one to develop something called fish love. I don't know if you've heard of the term fish love before, but essentially what is fish love? So when a man says he loves fish, what does he mean? Like, basically what he means is that he really likes fish when he fries it and cooks it and makes it into a nice, succulent, tasty meal, perhaps with some chips and perhaps with some ketchup. I don't think he means that he wants to sort of really look after, protect, and nurture the fish. So similarly, whenever there's an enjoyment mentality within a relationship, a person tries to see how the other person can benefit them for one's own advantage. On the other hand, love means having a service attitude, and love means sacrifice. And it's actually stated that in this world, the highest form of love experienced between 2 individuals is actually the love between a parent or a mother, or a parent, and a child. This is because when a parent looks after a child, there is so much sacrifice and selfless service involved. So, for example, like the mother has to wake up at night to sort of repeatedly comfort the child, feed the child. And even though like the mother or the parent may not like serving the child, still they do so out of that spontaneous service attitude they have. And then when the child eventually does grow up, the mother has to deal with the child's impudence and ungrateful behavior. So as a side point, what I find really interesting is that within the purport, Prabhupada refers to addressing every woman apart from one's wife as one's mother. And I think this really emphasizes that whilst interaction between men and women within a civilized society is of course limited, where such interaction takes place, there should be the utmost concern and utmost respect for the other individual. So then you may ask, how does one actually maintain a deep level of concern and a deep level of respect towards every living entity? And it ultimately boils down to love of God. So when one's heart is filled with love for the divine, then this expands one's consciousness as well as frame of reference. So basically, once your consciousness is expanded, then you're no longer agitated by the trivialities of this world, whether it be something tempting or whether it be something disturbing. And there's a very nice verse in the Gita which very metaphorically explains how this consciousness really helps. So it's in the second chapter, 70th verse. Apuryamana machala pratishtam samudramapa pravishanti tadvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sashantim apnoti nakama kami. A person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of desires that enter like rivers into the ocean, which is ever being filled but is always still, can alone achieve peace and not the man who strives to satisfy such desires. So basically what this verse is saying that is if our consciousness is as vast as the ocean, and it becomes as vast as the ocean when we connect with a source that's infinitely greater than us, and of course Krishna being the supreme controller and the supreme personality of Godhead. If we ultimately take shelter of Krishna, who's the source of everything, then by connecting to a source far greater than us, we're not able to sort of become disturbed even if the rivers of desires enter our mind. On the other hand, if our consciousness is like a puddle, then the slightest of rainfall or the slightest of agitation will cause us to easily become disturbed. So ultimately, it's stated in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Atmendriya Priti Vanchatari Balikam, Krishnendriya Priti Icha Dhara Premanam. The desire to gratify one's own senses is kama or lust, and the desire to please the senses of Lord Krishna is called prema or love. So another way you could look at raga or dvesha, or attachment or aversion, is to essentially see them as two sides of the same coin. So I just want to give an example that I heard in my Bhakti Shastri class. So once upon a time, there were two brahmacharis or celibate monks who were essentially traveling in rural India. And they eventually came to a river crossing. At the bank of the river, they noticed an elderly lady who was also eager to cross the river. But because the river current was so strong, she was unable to do so. And therefore, the elderly lady asked the two brahmacharis whether they could carry her on their back so that she could cross. Now, of course, being brahmacharis or being celibate monks, they try and minimize contact with the opposite gender. So what the sort of more junior brahmachari did was he just sort of ignored the request and crossed the river by himself. The senior brahmachari, however, carried the elderly lady, crossed the river and dropped her over to the other side. And then the two brahmacharis started walking on their happy journey. So about 20 minutes later, the sort of more junior brahmachari asked the more senior monk, "Why did you carry that elderly lady on your back?" And then the senior monk replied, "You have been carrying that lady in your head for the last 20 minutes, whereas I only carried her for 2 minutes." So the point is that when we're excessively attached to something, or when there is excessive attachment, or when we're excessively repulsed by something, then essentially that same energy is still there. So let me give you another sort of perhaps more mundane, but maybe a bit more relatable example of how this actually works. So say if there's like a really famous celebrity that you've always adored. So I'll need your help here. Any famous celebrities that you can sort of just shout out the name of that you've always sort of admired or adored? Can be literally anyone from movie star to sports star or whatever. Shout out anyone. That's very transcendental. just like any movie star. Sorry? Ronaldo. Thank you, Ronaldo. Yes, yeah. So imagine this situation, right? So you're at the airport. You're at some airport in Portugal or Spain or wherever, and then you see Ronaldo like literally like a few meters away from you, And then, like, you go to Ronaldo, you say to them, like, I'm your number one fan. Like, I've literally followed every single of your game. Not just every single of your game, every single of your goal. Like, I've been following you on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Like, all I just want is one selfie, just one autograph. And then what Ronaldo does is that he just looks at you with utter disdain, or perhaps even totally ignores you and just walks past as if you didn't exist at all. So then, I'm sure that, like, at that moment, you'd be thinking, like, oh my gosh, he's so rude. Like, I just hate him so much. So, like, that same attachment, that same madness that you had for Ronaldo, like, you're following him all your life, that same attachment very quickly turned into almost hatred or almost, like, disgust. Like, how could he be so rude? Like, and then perhaps, like, you wouldn't watch their football game for another few months, or you might post something not very nice about them on social media. So it's really interesting how attachment, that same energy can so easily quickly transform into hatred. And there's actually science to that. That's explained in the 62nd verse of the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Dhyayato vishayan pumsa sangasteshu pajayate sangat sanjayate kama kamat krodha bajayate. While contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops attachment for them, and from such attachment, lust develops, and from lust, anger arises. So just using the model of this verse, let's sort of analyze, like, what exactly happened. So say in the example of a famous celebrity, like, you start to hear or contemplate about them. So you start to, and that's called the dhyayato phase. Say if you heard about Ronaldo from your friend, for example, and then you start to watch all their games, all their football matches, and then you develop some sort of attachment for them, and that's sangas. Attachment means sangha. And then Shri Radha Gokulananda Bhagwan ki jai, jai Sitaram Lakshman Hanuman ki jai. So then that becomes attachment or sangas, and from attachment, what you want to do is you desperately want something from them, like maybe you want an autograph, a selfie with them. And another way of or perhaps you just want to keep watching their football games, And this is basically the karma stage or the lust stage where you want to, like, try and enjoy for yourself. Ultimately, what happens is that when they don't fulfill your desires, or watching endless Ronaldo videos on YouTube for hours upon end doesn't fulfill your desires, what happens is that this actually leads to krodha. So this leads to frustration or anger. And the Bhagavad Gita sort of continues to give us a few more steps in the subsequent verse, but we won't sort of go down that line. So essentially it begins with contemplation, dhyayato, then attachment, sangas, and then it becomes into karma. And then when lust or karma is unsatisfied, then it becomes into krodha or anger, frustration. And that's kind of how sense gratification ultimately leads to frustration. And the problem with sense gratification is threefold, actually. So either you can't achieve it. If you do achieve it, it's not how you imagined it to be. And even if you achieve it, and it's totally like how you imagined it to be, it's temporary. So let me give a really lame example. Like, I'm no good at examples. So say if you want like a car, like say if it's a super expensive car, A, you can't afford it. B, even if you can't afford it, like when you're going up a hill, you realize that going from 0 to 60 miles per hour takes like 100 seconds, and you're like, what's going on? And then even if it's like a really fast racing car, what happens is that ultimately the car will come to its mileage and will ultimately naturally, you'll have to sort of give it up, or it will be replaced by something which may be far better. So that's sort of the case with material sense gratification. And then recently I was sort of doing a thought experiment, like, what if material sense gratification, you can achieve it? You know, it's always going to be how you imagined. And when you do achieve it, it's always how you imagined, and it's always permanent. So what if, like, sense gratification didn't have the flaws that we discussed? Like, would it still be worth it? And you'd be interested to know that Hiranyakashipu, who's a demon from the 7th canto of the Bhagavatam, also raised the same question. So I don't know if you guys know the story of Hiranyakashipu, but basically he was a demon from the 7th canto of the Bhagavatam who decided to perform lots of severe austerities to gain a boon, and essentially he wanted to become invincible. So he performed so many austerities, such as sort of standing on his tiptoes for years and years upon end, and sort of with his arms up outstretched. And once eventually Lord Brahma was sort of pleased with his austerities, then Hiranyakashipu asked for a boon. So the boon he asked was that he basically prayed to almost become invincible. So he prayed not to die from the hands of any living entity born from Brahma. He also asked not to die within residence inside or outside, nor by any weapon, nor within the sky, nor the ground, nor a human being, nor an animal. So Hiranyakashipu essentially became immortal, or at least almost immortal. And using his power, he essentially terrorized the universe. And he could literally get whatever he wanted. Like, he was so powerful, like even the movement of his eyebrows would absolutely terrify the demigods. So like, say for example, if Hiranyakashipu was feeling a bit too hot one day, and instead of having to turn the AC on like we do, he would literally just raise his right eyebrow, and then all the demigods would suddenly make it a bit cold for him. And if he would raise his left eyebrow, it would start raining, for example. So he was essentially so powerful, and like he could literally get whatever he wanted, any object of sense gratification, and it seemed that he could enjoy for a very, very long time. Yeah, what was really, really interesting was that Hiranyakashipu was so insecure. And the reason why is because what was the name of Hiranyakashipu's son? Do you know? Prahlad, yes, thank you very much. So Prahlad was only 5 years old at the time. So Hiranyakashipu had Prahlad sitting on his lap. So when Prahlad uttered the name of Vishnu just once, Hiranyakashipu immediately threw Prahlad on the floor, and he was like totally insecure, and Hiranyakashipu felt totally threatened. And later, Hiranyakashipu, what he decided to do was eventually kill his son Prahlad in various ways. So I think we're sort of familiar with the story that Prahlad was chucked in a pit full of snakes, thrown down a cliff, thrown in an ocean, put into fire. But still, his son Prahlad was so cool, was so composed, because he was constantly always remembering Lord Vishnu and sort of never really forgetting him. And so later we all sort of know the story how Hiranyakashipu was eventually killed by Lord Narasimhadev, who's the half-man, half-lion incarnation of Lord Vishnu. And of course, Lord Narasimhadev did fulfill the vows of Lord Brahma. So basically, Lord Narasimhadev killed Hiranyakashipu with his nail, so that's not really a weapon. Hiranyakashipu was seated on the lap of Lord Narasimhadev, so that's neither the sky or the ground. He was killed at twilight, which is neither the day or night. And he was killed at the doorstep, which is neither inside nor outside. And you can see a nice painting over there, which sort of illustrates that pastime, in case you've not really noticed. So the point why I'm telling you this story is to illustrate the fact that even if we achieve invincibility in our material influence, or even if we achieve every desirable object in this universe, unless we acknowledge the presence of the Supreme Lord, we'll always feel insecure. And it's stated in the Bhagavad Gita, Param Brahma, Param Dhama, Pavitram Paramam Bhavan. So Arjuna says, "O Krishna, you are the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the ultimate abode, the absolute truth." And that's the reality. Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Ultimately, everything belongs to him. Ekale Ishvara Krishna, Arya Sabhya Bhritya. Our position is to serve the Lord. So it's stated, no matter how much facility we get for material enjoyment, without being a servant of the Lord, it's not really possible to be happy. It's just like a fish being out of water. And so then you may ask, why do I have to be a servant? I don't want to be a servant. But actually, it's stated in the scriptures that Krishna is so kind that even though he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, everything belongs to him, and we're his part and parcels. By serving Krishna in the right way, in a mood of trying to please him, in a mood of trying to serve him, then the bliss that's experienced is actually higher than the bliss even Krishna feels. So that just sort of emphasizes how kind of a personality Krishna is, although he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So then a valid question may arise in your minds. Is all sense enjoyment bad? So say if we're listening to some good music, I don't know, it might be some classical music, but not necessarily devotional. Say if we're appreciating the beauty of nature. Say if we've plucked a flower from the ground and really appreciating its fragrance. Or say if it's a nice hot summer's day, perhaps not like today, and we're having a nice cold juice drink. Is this all really bad? That's a natural question. So there's three approaches of looking at this. The first approach is to say that this is all just Maya, illusion. Anything related to the senses and the sense objects is bad, and therefore just to try and reject everything that makes you happy and try and renounce the world. But then the question arises, Was there anything of ours in the first place to renounce? And you can only truly renounce something if something actually belonged to you. So was it yours in the first place to renounce? But anyways, this mood of renunciation from all types of enjoyment is the approach of the Gyanis. The second approach is to try and exploit everything in this world for our own pleasure. So to try and max out on every single type of enjoyment. So whether it be listening to music, eating food, and, I mean, superficially, this doesn't seem bad, right? You're just having a good time. But often this path leads to a slippery slope because the more one tries to enjoy for one's own pleasure, then what happens is one becomes more implicated for wanting to enjoy for oneself. And this is usually at the expense of others. And this is the path of the karmis. A third approach is the middle way. And the third approach is to enjoy the things I mentioned above, but to acknowledge the source of those gifts. So for example, Krishna says in the Gita, Rasoham apsu kaunteya. He says in 7.8, I am the taste in water. So whenever we're having a nice drink, we can remember that Krishna is actually the taste in this. Krishna says in the subsequent verse, Punyo gandha prithivyam. Krishna is the original fragrance of the earth. So when we're smelling a flower, for example, that fragrance is a representation of Krishna. Krishna also says in 7.8, Shabda ke paurusham nrishu. Krishna says, I am the sound in ether and the ability in man. So when we're listening to some music, and that music has, is really amazingly composed, and that really draws our attention, then that actually is a representation of Krishna. Of course, it's best to always listen to Kirtan all the time, but even if we're attached to listening to hip-hop, R&B, Bollywood, wherever, if that really draws our attention, and if that really captivates us, then actually that's a representation of Krishna, because Krishna ultimately says, Yad yad viputi mat sattvam shrimad urjitameva va tat tat eva vagachatvam mama tejo amsha sambhavam. He says that no, all opulent, beautiful, and glorious creations spring from but a spark of my splendor. Yeah. So therefore, anything in this world that captivates our heart, that captivates our mind, is ultimately a representation of Krishna. And that is the understanding of the devotee. And I once had it in a class, I think Sachinanda Maharaj once said that karmis romanticize the world, jnanis demonize the world, whereas the bhakti yogi utilizes the world. And what does it mean for a bhakti yogi to utilize the world? It ultimately means that a bhakti yogi uses this world to increase his remembrance and service to the Lord. And it's stated in the Padma Purana, Smartavya satatam Vishnur, Vismartavyo najartuchit, Sarve vidi nishedyarsyor etayor vakinkara. Krishna is the origin of Lord Vishnu. He should always be remembered and never be forgotten at any time. All the rules and prohibitions mentioned in the Shastras should be the servants of these two principles. So when we're constantly remembering Krishna, then it inspires us to try and serve Krishna. And I guess we're so fortunate to be at the temple. Like, we don't have to deny our senses, but we can engage our senses in serving the Lord. So, like, say if we're beholding the beautiful forms of Radha Gokulananda, who incidentally we celebrated the 50th anniversary last weekend. So 50 years since they were installed, yeah, as I was saying. So, like, it's so pleasing, it's so nice. We're engaging our sight. When we're sort of participating in Kirtan, then we're naturally engaging our mouths, our ears, and it's so melodious. And I guess, best of all, we have the opportunity to honor so much delicious prasadam. So I guess you're not denying your senses when you're engaging in bhakti yoga. It's all about engaging the senses. And I think what distinguishes the process of bhakti from ordinary material sense enjoyment is the mood of service. And the crux of this is stated in the first canto, second chapter, 6th verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Save pum samparo dharmo yato bhakti radhokshaje ahetukiya pratihata yatma suprasiddhati. The supreme occupation or dharma for all of humanity is that by which man can attain to loving devotional service unto the transcendental Lord. Such devotional service must be unmotivated and uninterrupted to completely satisfy the self. So this verse is essentially stating that when one engages in devotional service in a mood that is totally selfless, that one wants to sort of simply please the Lord, then there's nothing really else that can satisfy the self, satisfy the heart. And I guess if you're at that stage, then you've essentially made it. For me, I think that's probably lifetimes away, but anyways. It's stated that bhakti yoga is the manifestation of the highest form of love and the highest form of bliss, and there's a nice verse in the 18th chapter to demonstrate that. So, Brahma bhuta prasannatmana shochati nakangshati samaha sarveshu bhuteshu mad bhaktim labate param. So one who is thus transcendently situated at once realizes Supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. He never laments or desires to have everything. He's equally disposed towards every living entity. In that state, he attains pure devotional service to me. So coming to the end, you'll be pleased to hear. Just wanted to conclude, just wanted to reiterate how fortunate we are that we have so many opportunities to engage in devotional service coming to the temple. And sort of a plug, but not so much of a plug. I guess tomorrow is Julan Yatra, so the Swing Festival of the Lord. And even though we may be so unqualified to render direct devotional service to Radha Gokulananda, they're so merciful by the grace of Prabhupada and by the grace of the devotees, we have the opportunity to swing them. And in the background, there's singing of Jaya Radhe, Jaya Krishna, Jaya Vrindavan. So it's a really basically melodious bhajan in glorification of Radha and glorification of Krishna and in glorification of his interactions with the residents of Vrindavan. So that's basically, it's a very nice, sweet, melodious occasion and joyous occasion. And that's basically tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. from 27th to 31st of August. So I think it's in the mornings and evenings, so please do make it if you can. So just to summarize this class, I mentioned right at the start, our chapter 3 is all about karma yoga, performing your allotted duties for the satisfaction of the Lord. Even when performing one's duties, there is every chance of becoming overcome by excessive raga attachment towards sense objects and dvesha aversion towards religious principles. And therefore, it's important to keep raga and dvesha regulated, whatever occupation one is performing. Raga and dvesha are ultimately two sides of the same coin. They stem from an enjoying mentality. Now, material enjoyment isn't necessarily bad. It's bad when we forget God in the process. When we remember God, and ultimately, when we remember God, this should ultimately inspire us to serve Him and thereby relish the highest and sweetest form of bliss. And see you tomorrow at 7 a.m. So, final note, thank you very much. I'm just this class was just basically for my own benefit. So I'm not really that used to giving classes, but I guess they say that if you try and teach something, then you're more likely to internalize something. So hopefully, by your prayers and blessings, I might be able to internalize something what I said. So thank you very much. Hare Krishna. So does anyone have any corrections or any questions or anything they'd like to share? Anything that didn't make sense? I also speak quite fast, so... Any questions at all? Yes, Prabhu, yes, thank you. Yes, very good question. So Prabhu's question is, how do we know what our varna is or what our occupational duty is? Yeah, so there's various ways to go about it. I suggest you read the 18th chapter, I think from verse 41 to 46. I can't remember. But essentially in the 18th chapter, I think it's the 43rd verse. I can't remember essentially, but Krishna describes various qualities related to each of the varnas. So the brahmanas, he says, Shamodamastapa shocham, shantir arjamevacha. And then he says basically peacefulness, self-control, austerity, purity, tolerance. So he describes various qualities of the brahmanas, and then he describes various qualities of the kshatriyas. Then he describes various qualities of the vaishyas and various qualities of the shudras. So definitely read the 18th chapter. I think it sort of provides a better outline of these the characteristics of each varna, and then you can try and relate to them. But I think within our context, because we're not really living in a Vedic society, it can be hard to often superimpose. I mean, they're certainly there, they're certainly valid, don't get me wrong, but it's often harder to totally identify. But definitely read the 18th chapter nonetheless. But there's also various personality tests that you can find online. So it's really interesting. I have a friend who works for a very large corporate organization. He's not really a devotee as such, and I was just meeting up with him recently. And he was telling me, that within his organization, they have 4 colors to distinguish between various personalities. And he was saying that the reds are those who are quite fiery in nature, those who are determined, those who are constantly on the go. And then they have the yellows, who are quite extroverted, social. They love strategy. They love planning. They love, and I guess the yellows may be sort of more akin to the Vaishyas. The reds may be more akin to the Kshatriyas. And then the blues are sort of more thoughtful, more analytical, like to think things through deeply, and that's sort of more akin to the Brahmanas. And then the greens are sort of more collaborative in nature, more hands-on, and don't really like conflict. And they make great team members, and I suppose they're the Shudras. So I think there's various personality tests you can do as well. online. And I guess I'm not saying that these four are watertight in the sense that if you're a green, you're a Shudra, if you're a blue, you're a Brahmana. But I guess they give you some indication or some inclination. So I think there are personality types you can do. And I think another way is sort of speaking to devotees. Like, I think if you sort of, if you have a trusted friend who's known you for a while, then they might be able to provide you with a bit more impartial of a perspective on what your personality type is. Another way could just be trying out various things attributed to the various varnas. So if you want to experiment with a Brahminical nature, then maybe try studying, or if you want to experiment with the Vaishya nature, then try sort of business. So basically experiment, trial and error. And sorry, just to conclude my answer, there's one last thing I want to state. So I heard from my mentor, the way you identify your varna is the values you identify with. So Brahmanas, for them, they're all about truth and compassion. If that's your motto in life, perhaps you're a Brahmana. Kshatriyas are all about power and justice. Vaishyas are all about growth and expansion. And Shudras are all about self-expression and security. So I guess your varna essentially is determined by what you value and prioritize in life. So I don't have one single answer. I'm sorry, it was a very long-winded answer, but it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a while. But thank you for your question. Yeah. Anyone have any sort of yes?
How can you progress towards Krishna's mercy?
I mean, if I knew that, if I had the answer, then I would definitely tell you. But I think so. The question is, how can we progress towards Krishna's mercy? So Krishna describes the ninefold processes of Bhakti Yoga. So it starts with Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, Padusevanam, Vandanam, Archanam, Dasyam, Sakyam, Atma, Nivedanam. So that's the 9 processes of devotional service. So devotional service ultimately boils down in these 9 processes. And it starts off with hearing. Hearing is really, really important. So like, I love listening to classes by various speakers, so you can just sort of go on ISKCON Desire Tree or YouTube and like whoever your favorite ISKCON speaker is, or you can just listen to the classes, come to the morning program for classes. And I think what hearing does is that it awakens Shraddha. So like there's 9 processes of devotional service, there's also the 9 steps on the stages of devotion. So the first step is Shraddha, so faith, and then it's Sadhu Sangha, or association with devotees, and then it's Bhajana Kriya. And then Bhajana Kriya means practice of devotional service, and Nartha Nivritti is the start of the unwanted habits in the heart being cleared. So what hearing does is that it inspires faith within us that perhaps there is a Krishna, perhaps there is a God who's very loving, who's very caring. And then what happens with Shraddha is that you sort of start to associate with devotees, so Sadhu Sangha. After you start to associate with devotees, then you start to engage in Bhajana Kriya, so a regulated form of devotion with like chanting, hearing, something like that. So I think, I guess we just have to try our best in whatever stage we're at. Now, for different people, it will sort of manifest in different ways. But I think just being honest to ourselves, how much can we do today in order to try and serve and please Krishna? And I guess the little amount of devotional service we do, say if we're just chanting 1 round or 2 rounds, if we're doing it in a mood, like I said, of trying to serve Krishna, to please Krishna, so not thinking about ourselves, but in a mood of trying to please him, then that's really, really powerful. Is that okay? Yes. Okay, sure. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much. Yes, Prabhu. Sure. So the question is, how do we know our current level of consciousness? So I think once you sort of, I think what can happen is, at least for me, it's very easy to become, when we start practicing devotional service, then we're super enthusiastic and we're thinking we're making progress at exponential rate. But if we actually start the process of devotion, so that maybe chanting around a day or reading or something, then it's stated in the Bhagavatam that Shrin Vatam Swakatha Krishna Punya Shravana Kirtana Hridiyanto Stohya Badrani Hridinoti Surit Satam. So once we start chanting or once we start engaging in devotional service, then what actually happens is that Krishna within the heart, the Paramatma, physically gets a broomstick and starts to clear away the unwanted anarthas and the dust within our heart. And then we're oh my gosh, I thought I was so beyond this. How is it that I still have such bad desires, or how is it that I have still such negative thoughts within me? So actually, it's really hard to know our level of consciousness unless we practice devotional service. And the more we practice devotional service, we'll actually be like, wow, like all of this, mud still there. So then I guess we sort of start awakening that to what our reality is. But I think at this stage it's important not to be discouraged, to keep going, because it's just a part and parcel of the process. So I guess just keep practicing, and then you sort of be more aware. And I think what devotional service also does is that enables you to be more in the mode of goodness, so be more mindful of your practices. Once you're more mindful, then you're more aware of what's going on. Is that okay? Is that okay? Yeah. Sorry, I tend to ramble. I think we only have like 5 minutes left till Gaura Arti. So I'm not really sure. Okay. Please. 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 Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So just for the benefit of people who didn't hear that, Mataji basically said that what's really important in life is to also have the guide of a mentor, of a guru, and they provide an impartial perspective. And without such support and guidance, it's really hard to know where you are and really hard to progress. So yeah, thank you. I totally missed that point. So yeah, it's really important to have a guide like a mentor or a guru as well in spiritual life. Okay, thank you very much. Enlighten, yes, yeah, cool. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Hare Krishna, dear devotees. The curtain will open in a few minutes, and we're going to have Gaur Arti. Please, can you all stand up and put your mats away? Thank you. Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhuji. Thank you for the class. Is it working? Is it working? Yeah. Thank you. Mataji, you want to take this?
Yeah. You?
Oh, no, I live in Canada.
Huh?
I live in Canada.
Oh,
I've seen you in Mauritius.
how long have you been here?
This September, mid-September.
Oh, we should go.
Where did you meet? In Vrindavan?
Maybe.
Join.
I joined here.
In Duleka. Krishna Dasani Maharaj. Yeah. Where is that Prabhuji who used to come?
He's on holiday. He's back on tomorrow, I think. No, Monday. Monday.
You miss the devotees who always
Yeah, we miss him. We miss him a lot.
I don't know. The words of the Gaur Aarti is on our right here on top. Everybody can follow. But please don't sing together. Sometimes I'm confused. Thank you. श्री श्री राधा गोकुलानंद की, श्री सीता राम लक्ष्मण हनुमान जी की, श्री श्री गौर निताय की, शीला प्रभुपाद की। जीव जय जय गौरा चांदे, आरती को शोभा। जीव जय जय गौरा चांदे, आरती को शोभा। जीव जय गौरा चांदे, आरती को शोभा। जीव जय जय गौरा चांदे, आरती को शोभा। जानवी तत्वानी जग मन लोभा। जानवी तत्वानी जग दासीने निताय कान, बामे गजगाधा। बामे गजगाधा। निकाते आद्वैताश्रेणी बस चक्रधारा। बशी अच्छे गौरचान, रत्ना सिंहासनी। गौरचान, रत्ना सिंहासनी। बशी अच्छे आरती को रे ना ब्रह्मा, आदि देवगाने। Adhikori Chamarajlaya Nara Hari Adhikori Chamarajlaya Sanjaya Mukunda Basu Ghoshadhigaya Sanjaya Mukunda Basu Ghoshadhigaya Sankha baje ghanta baje baje karatala Karatala Shanga Baje Ghanta Baje Madhuram Ridanga Baje Paramarasala Madhur 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 Baje Sangha baje ghanta baje Madhur 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 baje Nitai Gaur Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitai Gaur Hari Bol Nitai Gaur Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitai Gaur Hari Bol Bahu koti chandra jini badana ujwala Bahu koti chandra jini badana ujwala Bahu Gadagada. Narada Premi Gadagada Shiva Sukha Bhakti Vinoda Dekhe Gora Rasampada Gora Rasampada Jayo Jayo Gora Chande Arati ko Shobha Janavi Tatavani Jagamanalobha Gaurangi Aroti Koshobha Jagajanamanya Lobha Gaurangi Aroti Koshobha Jagajanamanya Lobha Jagajana mana lobha Nitai Gaur Hari Bol Nitai Gaura Hari Bol Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Iti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatari Satarine Prabhupada Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktivedanta Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktivedanta
Shiva Sadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Rama,
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Krishna, Krishna. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare
Hare
Hare.
Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Hare.
Hare Ram, Ram Ram,
Krishna 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 Hare 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 Ram 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 Hare Hare. Stop it. Shri Radha Gokulananda ki, Shri Sita Ram Lakshman Hanuman ji ki, Shri Gaur Nitai ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Gaura Premanandi, Shri Hari Bol. Not now. Hare Krishna, dear devotees, please can you all bow down? We are going to recite the Prema Dhwani. Thank you. Jayam Vishnupad, Paramahansa Pajakacharya, Stota Satsman Bhakti. Jayam Vishnupad, Paramahansa Pajakacharya, Stota Satsman Bhakti. Okay, bow down. Everybody's going to bow down. Jayo Vishnupad, Paramahansa Pajakacharya, Stota Satsman Bhaktivedanta Manor ki jai. Jayam Vishnupad, Paramahansa Pajakacharya, Stota Satsman Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj ki jai. Iskon Foundyacharya, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Namacharya, Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem se Gaur Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Shri Advaita Gadadhara, Shivasati Gaura Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Shri Radha Krishna Gop Gopinath Sham Kund Radha Kum Giri Govardhan ki jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Shri Mayapur Dham ki jai. Jagannath Puri Dham ki jai. Ayodhya Puri Dham ki jai. Mathura Puri Dham ki jai. Ganga Mai ki jai. Jamuna Mai ki jai. Bhakti Devi ki jai. Tulsi Devi ki jai. Shri Brihat Mridanga ki jai. Transcendental Buddhist Vision ki jai. Shri Harinam Sankirtan ki jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrind ki jai. Sama Bhakta Veda Vrind ki jai. Iskan Vartaman Guru Vrind ki jai. Gau Mata ki jai. Gaura Premanandi Hari Hari Bol. All Gurus assembled devotees. All Gurus assembled devotees. All Gurus assembled devotees. All Gurus Gurus and Gauranga. All Gurus Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna. Thank you. Thank you.
Go do quickly, I want to leave.
Shri Nishimdai Bhagwan ki, Prahlad Maharaj ki. Namaste Narasimhaya.
Hiranya
I'll go to Father if you did.
Yeah, you can go.
Said she wanted to sing